Hi, everybody. We're just going to take a couple minutes to make sure everybody can log in, and then we'll get started. We've got a few people that are still logging on. Smita, I think you can go ahead and get started here.
All right, it's 6:02 right now. We'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Local Mitigation Strategy Workshop. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're holding this workshop as a part of our 5-year update for the Local Mitigation Strategy Plan, or the LMS plan. So thank you for taking out time for this. This is a collaborative effort between Pinellas County's Housing and Community Development, Emergency Management, and Public Works. It's also a multi-jurisdictional plan. So we work on the plan with all the municipalities within Pinellas County. So thank you for joining us. Next slide. So before we get into the presentation, I'd like to introduce the presenters. I'd start with my introduction. My name is Smita. I work as a principal planner with Pinellas County. And I'd be walking you through the LMS plan, the overall requirements for the LMS 5-year update, and then I'll turn it over to Chris. So we have a team from Atkins who's been helping us with the 5-year update. And so we have Chris Zambito, who is the project lead from the Atkins side, who would be presenting the plan drafts that we've been working on as a part of the 5-year update. We also have Jennifer, Kaylee, and Jenny from the Atkins team who'd be helping us at the back end with the questions in the chat, as well as any technical issues that we might have. So thank you for joining us today. I'd like to say that this workshop was specifically scheduled as a part of the 5-year update. It was scheduled prior to the storms. However, I know there'll be a lot of interest in disaster recovery resources. So we would be covering some of that after we have finished with the main purpose of this workshop. with that, I turn it over to Jennifer, who would help us understand how you can add your questions to the chat and how we would be going through this presentation.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, you got a little preview as I jump through some slides here. Um, this is GoToWebinar is a platform we use a lot for these events. You'll notice if you are on your desktop, there is a question mark here on the top right. That is what you can click on to type in a question for the team, and we will answer those questions after the presentation. If we don't get to your question, we do have your email address, and we'll be happy to follow up with you afterwards. We will also be pasting some links into the chat box, which ends up showing up as your question box, that maybe some good resources, things like that, that you might want to follow up with. You can actually click on them during the webinar, or you can copy them down and save them afterwards. If you happen to be on a mobile device, this is how it looks. If you're on an iPad or if you're on your phone, again, that little question box is what you would click on to type in anything you have for the team. And then, of course, if you have any technical issues, you can always put something in the questions box if you can get there. If you can't get there for some reason, you can go to support.goto.com, and they're extremely helpful. We will also be putting the email addresses for contacts in this. You also, if you registered, you have email addresses for all those of us who are here tonight, and you can always follow up with us. We'll have the information available after this workshop. And with that, I'll hand it back over.
All right, thank you, Jennifer. Before we get into this, I'd like to say this again, that I know there's a lot of interest in post-disaster recovery resources. Although that is not the reason why we're having this workshop, you might have a lot of questions related to that. So please do not hesitate, ask as many questions as you have. I'll try to answer as much as I can in this time period that we have. However, if I'm not able to answer these questions, I'll get back to you. All right, so with that, we'll start with the presentation on the local mitigation strategy. For those of you who are new to this, the LMS is the Local Mitigation Strategy, our All Hazards Plan. It is a document that helps the local governments identify and mitigate potential hazards that could affect their jurisdiction. So this is our mitigation plan, which helps us identify projects well in advance of a disaster. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, it's an all hazards plan. So it looks at natural hazards such as hurricanes, flooding, and sinkholes, as well as man-made hazards such as hazardous waste spills and cybersecurity. Next slide, please. So based on the Stafford Act enacted under the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, all the jurisdictions within the state of Florida are required to have a hazard mitigation plan in order to be eligible for federal hazard mitigation funding. So the LMS plan is our hazard mitigation plan, which we maintain to get eligibility for hazard mitigation funding. Next slide, please. So the LMS plan is our mechanism to get that funding, and it ties into every phase of the emergency management: preparedness, response, and recovery. If you look at mitigation, mitigation means reducing or eliminating our risks. And through the LMS plan, we identify projects well in advance of a disaster so that we can implement those, and that would reduce our dependence on federal dollars in the long run. Next slide, please. So when we say we have to maintain the plan, there are two main steps that we have to do. One is the annual update, which is a state requirement. Every year, we have to update certain sections of the plan, which are then submitted to FDEM, which is the Florida Division of Emergency Management, for approval. So we maintain it every year, and then we also maintain it every 5 years, which is a FEMA requirement. Currently, we are going through both the annual update as well as a 5-year update. Our last 5-year update was in 2020, and now we are working on the 5-year update, which would lead to the 2025 LMS plan. Next slide. So why do we maintain the LMS plan? The LMS plan has a dual role. It is a hazard mitigation plan. It's also a floodplain management plan. As a hazard mitigation plan, it is a mechanism through which we become eligible for hazard mitigation funding, which comes from the federal government. It does not guarantee funding. It does not guarantee that our projects will be funded, but it makes us eligible for funding. Also, although we maintain the LMS plan, the county and all the municipalities, they work together to maintain this plan and go through the annual update and 5-year update. At the local level, there is no funding within the plan. There's no funding within the local mitigation strategy program. However, the work that we do to maintain the plan makes the county and all its jurisdictions eligible for hazard mitigation funding whenever it becomes whenever it becomes available. It's also a floodplain management plan, which means that the work that we do with the LMS plan and the LMS plan itself, it helps us earn credits under the National Flood Insurance Program community rating system, which then translates into flood insurance discounts for our residents. Next slide. There are different types of hazard mitigation funding which we can receive because of this eligibility that the LMS program brings to us. Some of this funding is pre-disaster funding, like the Flood Mitigation Assistance, FMA, the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, also known as BRIC. These are both pre-disaster funding, so you don't need to have a disaster. This comes every year. This becomes available every year. We also have post-disaster funding, which is mostly hazard mitigation grant program, also known as HMGP. Next slide, please. So we started with a 5-year update earlier this year. As a part of this update, we reviewed the current plan, which is our 2020 plan. We also reviewed and updated our LMS goals and objectives. We did our first workshop on April 15th. We also launched an online survey and also distributed actual physical copies of the survey at the April 15th workshop. We are now at the tail end of this 5-year update. So our plan is due to the state on November 6th. And this is our second workshop to gain input on the plan drafts that we've been working on. So with the rest of the presentation, we'd like to share the drafts that we've been working on. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Good evening, everybody. I appreciate you taking some time out of your day to listen to this and get some of your feedback on what we're doing here at the county. So, as Smita mentioned, this is a planning process that we're going through. And so part of this is understanding, how to frame different planning and policy documents within both the county as well as all of the municipalities. So like most plans, there are goals and objectives. These are the 6 that are in the current plan. Generally they cover a lot of different types of hazards that we might face, and there's kind of a catch-all with a disaster resilient community. And so that's intended to help when people put plans, comprehensive plans or other grant applications, they can reference that their projects are submitting these goals and objectives. Next, please. And so, within each of these different types of goals that we have there, in order to meet some of the compliance requirements that Smita was mentioning relative to the community rating system and getting flood insurance discounts, you have to kind of quantify those by different types of protection measures that you're doing and how these objectives and goals meet these different protection types. So, some of these are focused towards public education, some of them are property protection, some are structural projects. There's a lot more emphasis now on natural resource protection. So these are all just kind of quantified within the plan to help our auditors kind of know that we're meeting the objectives. Next. And so we had some facilitated sessions with all of the communities and participants to look at those. Again, it's a 5-year process, so we update these every 5 years, look at what's kind of changed in the community. There might be a little different mindset of, in policy as to what people want to do. And so we're focusing here that there were only a couple objectives that changed, and they were adding some minor objectives to make sure that we can. There's a lot of things that are actually happening within the county currently, and so we just want to make sure that those are getting incorporated into the policy side. And so these objectives now reference some higher standard opportunities, more emphasis on social vulnerability, looking for future hazards, which has been a big emphasis out of the federal government. You used to in the past have to kind of stick to what was historical patterns, and now we're able to look at some future conditions. And then we're looking at, making sure that all the great work that's been done by the communities to date is also getting referenced in these objectives. So next, please. So one of the key changes here, Smita had mentioned that this plan, although we do it at the county level, it does have some requirements that are federal as well, and the federal policies change every 5 to 10 years. And one of the changes that is a new requirement is based on social vulnerability. And so there's a lot more emphasis on understanding, where there's more communities at risk. They face, more adverse impacts when disasters happen. And so the plan documents different areas of vulnerability, and then we look at, not just where there might be some insufficiencies for income or access to food or whatever it might be, but also, how are natural hazards and other hazards impacting those communities. Next. And, one of the key things of having the 5-year plan is it's kind of a living document that helps to catalog different activities that have happened and things that change over time. In the 2010 to 2017 period, we really didn't have a lot of disasters and it was kind of quiet. And now you can see just in the last 5 years alone, we've had a lot of hurricane near misses, and now unfortunately some hurricane hits. We've had some tornadoes, we've had some severe storms, and so all those things get cataloged within this plan so that the communities, researchers, whoever is using this document, they have the ability to go in there and kind of have a catalog of all the different types of hazards that have occurred and what those impacts were to the community. Next. So, the emphasis on this is natural hazards from the federal perspective. To support local governments in the state, we also look at natural hazards, technological and man-made hazards. We're going to show a few slides just looking at some of the flood hazards. And, these are, again, a reference point for communities and people to look at where there's vulnerability and exposure to hazards, how many people, how many buildings. And so for every hazard that's identified within the document, you'll have a series of maps, you'll have a series of tables, you'll have narrative descriptions of what areas are more vulnerable to the different types of hazards. So this is just a snapshot here of flood. If you want to move to the next one. Again, flooding is the biggest concern we have in this community, and we're feeling it right now, unfortunately. So this is an example of the flood loss claims from the NFIP. It is a little tricky sometimes to get some of that data out of the federal government, but there's currently about 130,000 policies in the county, and this is showing that prior to these storms of the last couple of weeks, there were about 25,000 claims over the last 30 to 40 years. So that obviously is going to go up, unfortunately, but those are the kind of things that we catalog within the plan just so people have an easy reference guide as to what the conditions are here. Next. So one of the biggest concerns and emphasis both from the federal government side as well as the local government is looking at where there are repetitive loss properties. These are areas that flood fairly frequency within a continuing time period. So typically it's a 10-year time period. And we're also looking now at not just what is called a repetitive loss, which is within that 10-year period, but a severe repetitive loss. So those are where the damages essentially are more than the cost of the structure. And so the state and federal government want to understand where those are. Now, we don't document those down to the house level. These are protected under the Privacy Act. So what we do is try to document these things, somewhat spatially. And so the maps, when you have a better zoom and can look at them a little better, are highlighting areas of the county, and the dots are, larger or smaller depending on what kind of counts of repetitive loss properties we have, but it won't show down to a house level. Next. So the other kind of big concern that's been creeping up over the last few years and is getting more emphasis is looking at sea level rise. So again, that's just another phenomenon that's explored in this document. There's similar to the other um, hazards. There's maps, there's tables identifying how many structures are at risk under different conditions. This science is kind of changing all the time, so it's another good reason that there's opportunities to do annual updates in addition to 5-year updates. But this is what we use for this particular phenomenon. Next. And this is just using some of the projections here to show at that 1 foot, 4 foot, and 7 foot, I believe, inundation levels. Next. So unfortunately, we've experienced this too many times recently, but we're looking at tropical cyclones as well in this document. And some of these hazards they may sound similar, flood versus a cyclone and surge versus a severe storm that has flash flooding and surge and inundation, but they are kind of identified a little differently from the federal perspective. So we try to tease out data that's specific to the different types of hazards that are occurring. But you can see this area. We know it's likely to be hit. Unfortunately, we did just experience some of those direct hits. Next.
Sorry, Chris. I hit next, and we got some big graphics in here, so I'm watching it come up on the attendee side a little bit slower than I'm seeing. So just
No
um,
worries.
everyone
Yeah,
knows these maps are really detailed, which are really helpful. But yeah, just so everyone knows.
understandable. And we do use some different types of tools to look at these. And so in this case here, we're looking at different wind results. And so there are some tools that are endorsed by the federal government. You see there's something called HAZIS results. And so that's a software that the federal government supports communities using so that it's somewhat a standard approach when they're looking at grant opportunities and things across the country. And so you kind of have some probabilistic methods there to look at wind impacts to the community. And these models do build in some design standards and functions and roof types and structure types and cost of replacement. All that kind of gets into that tool so that there's a little more guidance as far as what damages might be like in the community. Next. And this is just an example showing the kind of the difference between, there are certain statistics that people are familiar with looking at. In this case, it's a 100-year and a 500-year, and it's just kind of quantifying that. Within that tool, you have the opportunity to look at these by different types of damage, and so there are stratifications of what damage might look like based on the structure, its original replacement value, and the modeling that's used within that tool to look at the damage that was done to the structure. Next. And so here, as we're all too aware, luckily we didn't have that picture on the right, but there is, great vulnerability to storm surge. The right storm with the right wind speeds and the right fetch of, moving in the right angle at you could produce surges even larger than we saw recently, unfortunately. But these maps just kind of help to quantify a potential depth of flooding to Pinellas County under those different scenarios. Next slide. So this is a really helpful analysis. It's not something that's required, but what this is doing is this is taking areas where we know there's potential storm surge that's beyond what FEMA calculates in their 1% special flood hazard area. And we know that human nature a lot of times is that if you're not required to do something, you don't do it. And so these are areas that are outside of where you're required to carry flood insurance, but we know that there's definitely an exposure to flooding there. And so we'd encourage people to carry flood insurance in these areas. And it's also good for the local governments to understand this, because if the residents aren't carrying flood insurance, that's another additional cost that local governments, federal governments, everybody's going to have to try to use to get people back to normalcy. Next slide. And so, there are some other hazards here. Severe storm is kind of a catch-all, and this is, through the National Weather Service and other data sets that are out there. But this is looking at, impacts from lightning, impacts from hail, some straight line winds, tornadoes. So they just, within their vernacular, they kind of just lump it all as severe storm. And so we try to quantify that as best we can. Next. And again, this is just showing some of that, the subtypes within the severe storm, and where historically we've seen some of those phenomenon occur. Next slide. So we also look at wildfire. Now, luckily, for the most part, Pinellas County is pretty built out, and so there aren't a lot of areas where there's high ignition and fuels for wildfire. A little more in the Northwest still there. But we do our best to quantify all the hazards that the county is potentially exposed to, and then those ones that are potentially more damaging to the residents, they have a higher exposure to that hazard, and potentially more damage. We put more focus on those type of hazards in the plan. Next. And these are some tools that different wildfire agencies use to kind of quantify where wildfires are likely to occur. So those are just more examples. Next. And again, we just kind of break down all that information, and this is required out of the plan from the federal government side and the state government side to look at all of these impacts per jurisdiction and to quantify it by building and structures exposed, as well as, where possible, the population that's potentially impacted. Next. And the last one we'll just touch on briefly here. We're probably going to see a lot of this, but this is erosion. And this is focusing on the map here on coastal erosion. These were areas that were already identified, through the beaches program at the state as being a high risk of erosion or already suffering erosion damages. And so we have a section in the plan that focuses on that as well. Next. And so one of the last things I want to touch on here, the plan covers a lot of different elements. We're showing you a lot of what they call the hazard identification and risk assessment section, but the plan also does cover, capabilities of local governments, what type of plans they have, what type of staff they have. And a key portion of the document, and the real reason that most communities participate in these plans, is that so they are eligible for federal disaster money. And so this is showing you that, kind of since the LMS started, for where people have documented hazard mitigation projects that they have actually performed, they've gotten in the ground, they've, built, that there's been over $750 million in hazard mitigation investments. So, some of this stuff is kind of quietly going on in the background, but, even something like streetlights, and making those more stable. You don't hardly see any crosswire streetlights anymore. Most of those have been strengthened and reinforced. A lot of intersections have generators, or at least the potential to receive generators. You have improved stormwater systems there, as far as trying to make them as much as possible, as strong as possible. It's limited funds, but we try to make sure that by being eligible with this plan, we can apply for more funding, and we can try to make the community as strong as possible through these opportunities. So with that, I think I'm going to hand it back over to Smita.
Thank you, Chris. So Chris went through all the updates that we are doing. So this is the work that needs to be done at the back end to make us eligible for hazard mitigation funding. And we do it every 5 years. There are some parts, as I had mentioned before, which are updated every year. But then the 5-year update is a massive update to the entire plan, especially the risk assessment section, which Chris shared with everyone. Now, the next steps for this, so we are coming close to the end of our plan update. We are due to submit the plan draft to the state by November 6th, which is 6 months in advance of the date when the plan expires. Our plan expires on May 5th, 2025. And when I say our plan, it means the same plan is the hazard mitigation plan for the county as well as all our 24 jurisdictions. So on May 5th, 2025, that's the expiry date. And so 6 months ahead of that, we have to finish all this work and we have to submit it to the state. The very reason why we are having this workshop, because this is a critical part of the 5-year update process. By May 5th, to help explain what the next steps are, so once we compile all the information that we get from the workshop, all the comments that you want to share, we compile the whole plan, and the plan draft is then submitted to the state by November 6th. After that, the state reviews the plan and checks it against the hazard mitigation policy document to see if we meet the FEMA requirements. And this is a regular part of the 5-year update. Once they're done with that, they come back to us with comments on what we need to improve or what are the things that we need to change in order to meet the requirements, the state as well as FEMA requirements. And so this back and forth, it goes through like 2 rounds of review by the state. And then once the state gives us a go ahead that we're good with the plan and it meets all the requirements, the plan is ready to be adopted. So between now and between November 6th and May 5th, we have to go through the review process with the state. They need to give us a letter which says that we can go ahead and adopt, and it has to be adopted by at least one jurisdiction out of the county and the 24 jurisdictions to be able, before May 5th, 2025, for us to not let the plan expire. So it's that critical that we need to do this. And as Chris shared, there's a lot of work that goes on with the 5-year update, and we're coming close to the end of this. Next slide, please. So if you want to learn more about the LMS plan or the LMS program, please visit the LMS website. It is pinellas.lms.org. Also, since the plan is a floodplain management plan, you would like to check out the floodplain protection webpage that the county has. Next slide, please. And Kaylee has added the link to the LMS webpage in chat. So that brings us to the end of the presentation for the LMS 5-year update. However, because we are currently in a recovery stage, unfortunately, we were impacted by 2 big storms and we are recovering from it. I know there are a lot of questions regarding immediate recovery needs. Also, there are a lot of questions regarding post-disaster long-term recovery needs like elevating homes. And so we'd like to share some of these resources because we got this opportunity to have this conversation. So we're sharing these resources, even though it's not the main purpose of this workshop today. There are a ton of resources on the Pinellas County Disaster Assistance webpage. Please check that out. Kaylee has added the link in the chat. Next slide, please. If you haven't applied for individual assistance, please do so. You can do that online at www.disasterassistance.gov or via the FEMA app. You can also call in and fill out the application, or you can visit a DRC, a Disaster Recovery Center. Next slide, please. These are the disaster recovery centers, the Florida Botanical Gardens, the Enoch T. Davis Center, and the Dunedin City Hall. Here, you would get assistance to fill out the form. If you're struggling filling it out online or via the phone, there are long waiting lines. You can go to any of these disaster recovery centers and you would get help for that. Next slide, please. In terms of long-term recovery, we also have the option of SBA disaster loans, but please note that these are disaster loans. And homeowners, renters, and businesses, they can apply for the SBA loans. But this is, as I mentioned before, the individual assistance is something related to our short-term recovery needs. These loans and other funding sources that are on the next slide, these are related to long-term recovery needs, and they take time. Next slide, please. So these are some of the funding sources that we typically see for long-term recovery: the Hurricane Loss Mitigation Program, the Flood Mitigation Assistance, FMA, and the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. The Hazard Mitigation Program, Grant Program, or the HMGP, is what we typically use for larger infrastructure projects, for stormwater improvements, infrastructure protection, basically projects which impact a very large section of our population. Flood mitigation assistance is typically what we use for elevations. And hurricane loss mitigation program, it is not used for elevation, it's mostly for retrofit, either wind or flood retrofit. Out of these three funding programs, the FMA and the HMGP, these are federal funding sources, and the HLMP comes from the state, although all three are administered by the state. Next slide, please. These are the contact information for, I work on the LMS program. So if you have any questions regarding the LMS plan, the LMS 5-year update, please reach out to me. We also, the slide also shows the contact information for the county's floodplain manager, Lisa Foster, and our emergency management director, Kathy Perkins. If you have any questions regarding the LMS 5-year update, and if you think there are people who couldn't attend this workshop and have questions, please note the deadline to submit to the state is our deadline to submit the draft, but there's still a lot of work that goes on after that. We went through, as I said, there's usually 2 or 3 rounds of review by the state, and as we're working through these reviews and update it based on what we are requested by the state, we have the opportunity to include your comments. Next slide, please. That brings us to the end of our presentation, and we'd like to take questions now.
I think we've received quite a few questions. If Ginny, if you are going to read them, or if Maxine.
Yep, I will begin reading some of these. So we do have a question. Are there any new programs that could help provide immediate help for elevating homes that are now designated as repetitive loss structures due to the multiple storms that have hit our area in the past few years?
So, Michael, none of these long-term recovery programs, they are not meant for emergency repair. So the time frame for that is long. So to answer your question, is there something immediate for elevation? It is not. It's a long process. You need to apply, and typically it is done through FMA. And I'll let Maxine also add to this anything that I miss out. But the process is a long process. All these are reimbursement programs, so which means that, and also with any federal program, first the project has to be approved. Once you're awarded the program, which takes time, they need to review the project. Once you're awarded that program, the construction can start. Once the construction is complete, and we submit the documentation, and if it meets all the requirements by FEMA, that's when the reimbursement happens. So it's not a quick process, it's a long process, and that's why it is not, none of those funding sources are considered as emergency repair or recovery programs. Those are long-term recovery programs. Next question, please.
Yes, so Smita, this is Maxine. I would like to add just a small gigabyte about that. My name is Maxine Moore. I'm with, I work with Lisa Foster in the floodplain management division here with Pinellas County. So with regards to those grant programs, as Smita said, they are typically long-term programs. They typically do, it's a long process to provide the application, wait for the application, then have FEMA review and approve the application. That tends to be a long process. You also have to apply through your municipality. The county can't apply on behalf of you if you do not live in unincorporated Pinellas County. So if you're wanting to apply for that particular grant program, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, you would need to contact your municipality that you live in. That particular program is opened on an annual basis. Unfortunately, the application period for this year is closed. However, it opens at the same time every year. The county is currently working with a lot of different programs and people to determine immediate funding assistance and long-term funding assistance for people who have had severely substantially damaged or have been damaged from the most recent storms. So we're working on developing a list of those particular programs and opportunities, and we'll be providing that out to the public when we get the list completed. Thanks, Smita.
Thank you, Maxine.
Great. So our next question is there going to be any information about immediate or short-term assistance in this meeting, or is this meeting to educate the public overall about the plan?
Michael, this workshop was scheduled prior to the storm. So actually, truthfully, this workshop was is something that we do as a part of our 5-year update. It was not meant to be focused on the disaster recovery, but we are in this context where we have gone through these 2 storms, and I know this is related to mitigation, and therefore we're sharing these resources. So the intent is to share the work that we have been doing on the LMS plan to be eligible for funding. I know right now there's a lot of discussion about what funding is available. Some of these hazard mitigation programs are not available. Some of these mitigation funding is not even open right now. These are long-term, and none of these 3 that I showed, HLMP, HMGP, and FMA, none of these are open right now. But it's just the timing of it that we went through the storm, so there's a lot of interest in it. We're going based on the timeline for the 5-year update. So this workshop was specifically scheduled just to talk about the plan. I understand your interest in the mitigation funding, but see this as an opportunity that you got to know who to contact, and you can always contact us. And by the time these funding opportunities open up, you know who to contact and who to ask questions. So there's something good that came out from it. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of information, and nor was this workshop specifically scheduled for that. Next question, please.
Great, thank you. We do have one here for my NFIP. My NFIP is FEMA and has been since 6/12/2020 to present. If you have information on that.
I don't understand the question. Maxine, would you know what that means?
So it sounds like the person who put this question in is just stating that they've had National Flood Insurance Program flood insurance, which is provided by FEMA through FEMA since 2020. Now, with regards to that, there are certain things that your insurance policy, if you have the National Flood Insurance Program, certain things that they do not cover or do cover in that is different from private flood insurance companies. So I would suggest if you have flooded and you have not done so already, make sure that you're filing your flood insurance claims and also checking and reading through your insurance policies to understand what is fully covered. And if you have questions about what is covered in your insurance policy, please reach out to your insurance agent so they can further explain to you what is covered, but make sure that you're also submitting those insurance claims as well.
Thank you, Maxine. I don't know, Regina, if that answered your question. If not, please type in a question, follow-up question.
And Smita, our next question is, can we access these graphics after the presentation?
Yes, we can make the presentation available.
Next up, we have, are the unincorporated areas of Pinellas County fully represented in the plan?
Yes, it's a county-wide plan, so it includes all the areas, the unincorporated and all the 24 municipalities. Yes. And our risk assessment looks at the entire county. And we are actually required to do the analysis for individual jurisdictions, the county, which includes all the unincorporated areas, as well as identify areas which are more socially vulnerable.
Smita,
Great. Our
if there's a slide you want me to pull up while you're talking, maybe that helps you to respond to any of these questions, just let me know and I can
Sure.
pull something up from the PowerPoint.
Thank you, Jennifer.
And
next
Smita,
question.
I'll add to that real quick too,
Thank
because
you.
it's um, every 5 years when we start this, we try to reach out to different nonprofits and other partners. Like we're focusing on this presentation on local governments, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other partners that are invited to these meetings and participate in these meetings. There are a lot of hospitals that attend these. There are sometimes utilities that attend these. And so it is a big cooperative process to try to holistically look at reducing exposure to these hazards and how we might be able to mitigate it. So it tries to be as inclusive as possible. It is run by the government, so it's not always that exciting. Not everybody comes, but we do have a lot of partners that participate in this beyond just the governments that we're talking about today.
Thank you, Chris.
Great. The next question that we have is there a good resource to discuss insurance needs and support for claims?
Maxine, can you help with that question?
Yes. So with regards to your insurance needs and helps with claims, I would first determine if your insurance policy is a private insurance policy or if it is a NFIP insurance policy. If it is an NFIP insurance policy, you can go to floodsmart.gov. That is the NFIP webpage. They just recently have been doing updates to it, so it's a lot easier to find information and the resources that you may need. They do also have like a quick 5-step um, flyer that is available on that webpage as well on filing your insurance claim. But I would first check to see if you have an NFIP policy or if it's a private flood insurance policy. And if it's a private flood insurance policy, I suggest reaching out to that company so that way you can determine how they would like you to file your claim. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Maxine. Next question.
Okay, our next question is when does the application period for FMA open and how does one apply?
So I would not pretend I'm an expert on FMA, but I'll give you an idea. Typically, the FMA applications open towards the end of the year. It hasn't opened up yet. I don't know. We don't have any information from the state yet, so I don't know when it opens up. And we are actually at the end of the year. But the state has also been very busy with the storms, so we don't know. But it is an annual grant, so it's available every year. I don't know if that
Gonna
answered your question, but we don't have a definite date on when it opens up. There is also, yes, go ahead, Maxine.
so I'm gonna also just chime in a little bit. So typically they open in the past recent years, we've seen that they've opened around the end of July, but that can also be the beginning of August, and they typically close in the fall time. This year, the application period has already been closed, but that is determined by the federal government, who then is able to put that information on the state. So as Smita is saying, it's usually the state that opens that application period. Typically with the flood mitigation assistance programs, the state of Florida has recently implemented a notice of intent to apply, which is as soon as the program opens up for application period for the federal government, the state requests municipalities who plan to apply on behalf of their residents who choose to participate in the program would have to submit a notice of intent, and there's a small period of that, and then they open up for the application period. Essentially what happens is that if you are a resident and you want to apply for this grant program, you have to request to apply to your municipality. The municipality then applies on your behalf to the state, who then applies on the municipality's behalf to the federal government. So it's kind of a chain that goes to that process. The state of Florida tends to be really on top of it when it comes to these grants. This year, that particular application period is already closed, so we're hoping that it will be able to be open again around the same time frame next year, but sometimes it can be a little bit later in the year than what was opened this time. Thanks, Smita.
Thank you, Maxine. Next question.
Excellent. So we do have a question here. When and how will the data and lessons learned from the recent storms be integrated into the next 5-year update?
So everything that we learned in the past few weeks and the comments that we received from this workshop, and even the emails that you guys you have been sending to me, all that would be documented, not the emails as such, but the content of the emails, what kind of requests that we are receiving. All that helps us highlight as to what are the important things which the community needs. So when we say, for example, the question about hazard mitigation that Michael had about, is there anything available in short term? We've not been in a situation like this before, where at such a massive scale that we've been impacted by a storm. And so now it's extremely important that we had something in place which is a short-term recovery. Quickly we could elevate a funding source that we could look to. And now we're looking for it. So these are some things which need to be highlighted with the plan update so that the state is also aware that this is a big need. So everything counts. So when you say how are the data and lessons learned from recent storms would affect us, you sending the emails to me, you sending emails to the state, all that helps highlight a certain issue, and that will be highlighted in the plan. So when we submit the plan to the state, all that is documented and goes into the appendix, which helps the state understand that maybe some of our processes need to change, maybe some of these, the process to apply to some of this funding needs to be easier, or maybe there are other mitigation sources that we need to look for. So it's helpful in many ways. It gives visibility to certain issues which otherwise wouldn't have been discussed. So I think that is very critical that the emails that are sent to the state and the questions that you're asking. At the same time, some of the things that we're discussing now are not common knowledge. So there's a lot of information gaps in terms of understanding how the FMA works, or understanding, what are the things that we're eligible for. Like understanding that at the local level we don't have funding, we're just maintaining the plan which gives us access to funding. Now these are things that are being discussed now only because a storm happened, and it's, frankly speaking, that's probably the reason why most of you are in this meeting. All that gets documented, which gives us the opportunity to identify what kind of projects need to be highlighted for mitigation in the next 5-year, not in the next 5-year update, in this 5-year update, so that we can tackle them in the next 5 years. So I don't know if that answers your question.
So thank you, Smita. I think that actually touched on what I was going to generalize next. So we've received a number of different questions based on certain locations and projects regarding backflow preventers and drainage systems. So I was hoping that you could talk a little bit more about the jurisdictions, project initiatives, and how those are tied to but separate from the plan.
So those are integral to the plan. So they're not separate. They're only separate from the plan in terms of which jurisdiction puts that in. But because all the jurisdictions are a part of the LMS program, they have the freedom to identify projects on their own. So yes, it is independent. However, these projects are all a part of the LMS plan, and all the staff from all these different jurisdictions work together on the LMS program. So things which are highlighted by one helps the other jurisdiction to understand that, hey, this needs to be done in our jurisdiction too. And when you say, what role does that play in in the LMS plan, it's very integral to it, because these big hazard mitigation funding, it's a slide. I don't know, Jennifer, if you could show the slide where Chris had shown the number of projects, the hazard mitigation projects. So all these projects identified by the different jurisdictions, these are all our mitigation efforts, our efforts to reduce our risk. And that's an ongoing effort, irrespective of the 5-year update. These are things that all the jurisdictions work on. So like, for example, when you say backflow prevention, was there are projects which are being which the cities are actively applying for, like City of St. Pete and other jurisdictions are applying for, irrespective of whether we have a storm or not. They apply for BRIC, they apply for hazard mitigation funding. Um, some of these are competitive, however, and this is where it ties into the other question, that how does the public input help? When you repeatedly ask the same question and you highlight that, and that gives us the opportunity to highlight that within the plan. And then when a related project goes for approval and goes for review to the state, it makes it much more, it emphasizes how important that is. It's a dire need. So it helps in many different ways, but the projects that all the jurisdictions identify is actually the main core of this LMS program. And these are done on a regular basis. We don't wait for 5 years. These are ongoing projects. Every time an HMGP is available, the jurisdictions apply for these.
Is this the right slide?
Yes, this is a slide I was mentioning.
Okay,
So
perfect.
there are projects that we all actively work on, actively identify. Doesn't need a storm, and it doesn't need a 5-year update. We're working on this every year.
And I,
Next.
I will say too, to that point, we try to set up the plan to be as opportunistic as possible, because the different grants, every year they could have slight different eligibility, and certain types of projects might be eligible. Certain funding amounts change per hazard and per what disaster has happened. And so, sometimes a project, could be a large structural project, and, maybe it's even for a hospital or something, and it takes a large chunk of funding. But we try to have a process where as many participating entities get funding out of these programs, and they can do these backflow preventers or whatever. But certain grants may not allow that particular type of protection measure to be eligible. So, that's kind of the intent of the plan, is to have something that where we can take your feedback and what you guys are experiencing in the community and what governments are, having to repeatedly pay for, and try to be as proactive as possible with, setting ourselves up for when that next opportunity comes. We're kind of prepared. We have an idea of what type of things we might want to go after, and we have the background to say it is a need in the community, it is supported, it is an area of social vulnerability, or whatever it might be. But that helps us to position these communities here for that funding.
Thank you, Chris. Next question, please.
Okay, we've got a few more questions. What efforts are being made to deduce hard and permeable surfaces and restore natural habitats that help to mitigate storms, such as beach dunes, mangrove buffers, and wetlands that can help absorb water?
So we have a number of projects that a number of jurisdictions are actively working on for mitigation with respect to wetland. There are a lot of projects which have been funded in the past and are I wouldn't say that is the that usually most of the projects that we see are bigger infrastructure projects, but we do have a lot of projects which are focused on our natural resources, and those tie into maintaining them and reducing erosion. All that is intricately linked to flooding, and so that is a big part of the HMGP projects that Chris had shown. Next question, please.
And another question kind of along the project line, does this program strengthen and enhance the power grid to mitigate outages from storms and other emergencies?
There are projects in it, and it is not like the prime focus. I wouldn't say as compared to the rest of it, like most of our projects are focused on flooding because that is one of the biggest issues here. But we do have projects related to that, if that's what you meant. So just to add to that, There is an active list of projects that we maintain as a part of the LMS program. So when we say projects, it means that the LMS program maintains, which includes all the jurisdictions, we maintain an active list of projects. So it is not just this maintenance of just the analysis that we do. The analysis helps highlight the key issues, and then based on these key issues and the goals and objectives that we had shared, all the jurisdictions, they identify projects. These projects become a part of an active list of projects that we pursue. Some of them we are currently unfunded. Some of them we are actively seeking funding for based on the priority that every jurisdiction has. Whenever a hazard mitigation grant program becomes available, we pick up, every jurisdiction would look at their list of projects and say, okay, we're going to go for these. We're going to apply for the hazard mitigation program for these high priority projects. So this could be a wide range of projects. It could have projects related to any kind of infrastructure, traffic related infrastructure, or it could be drainage issues, or it could be concerning our wetlands. So it's a wide range. It's like comprehensively looking at mitigation from many different perspectives. And this is the active list that we use every time a funding becomes available. Not every project on it is funded, and not every project that we apply for, let's say an HMGP becomes available, we pick up a project and apply it. Not every project gets funded. However, identifying that projects is a critical part, well in advance of a disaster, is a critical part of it, because each of these projects have been specifically identified because they have a role in mitigating our risks in future. And this spreadsheet, this slide that Chris showed, this is a summary of the total dollars which have been invested in hazard mitigation funding. This comes directly from that active list of projects that we pursue. Next question, please.
Great, and I think this is our last question that I see in our thread so far. Any programs to support investing in better windows or doors for my home?
I don't think the plan is a very broad level plan, and most of these projects that I mentioned are very large scale. But if you need resources for these, we can look up and get back to you on that. I don't know if anybody else would like to add to that.
Well, I think the most recent one has been the My Safe Florida Homes program, which has gone through, has been very successful as far as people applying for it and getting dollars. It continues to run out of money quickly every year with applicants, but there are caveats to that. The structures have to be a certain age, certain type. There are some limitations to it, but and I don't know, Smitty, you may want to touch on this a little bit at what you just had talked to me about earlier, where the state is kind of looking at residential mitigation programs and, seeing that there's been this need with all these storms lately, that, it is kind of a gap in looking at structures and how to get residential homes as opposed to just more government infrastructure focused projects.
Yes, thank you, Chris, for bringing that up. So most of these projects, the hazard mitigation projects, these are large-scale projects. These are infrastructure projects. These are not residential mitigation projects. However, this is where, with the storm, we do think that some things might change. The FMA, all these programs, the FMA hazard mitigation, they all have a very long time period for turnaround. These are all reimbursement programs. And when you look at residential mitigation, these are the options that are currently available. But this is where I was saying that, the storm has definitely brought more attention to this, and being vocal about it and the questions that you're asking, I think is very critical, because all that the timing, in some ways you would think that the timing is not good, but we're going through the 5-year update, but I think the timing is very good, because this is a time when we can actually document all those comments and the need for residential mitigation. Recently, the state has been thinking of assisting the counties, the small counties and the cities with residential mitigation. everybody has been thinking about it. It just hasn't come into fruition. And I think maybe with the storm, some processes might change, or there could be a change which could help us with residential mitigation, which is currently a gap here. Is there a related question? Are there other additional questions regarding this residential mitigation?
I think Jenny's looking.
I don't see any other questions regarding
Residential.
residential mitigation. There are some questions about the flooding events since ETA in 2020 and what kind of planning and lifting assistance are we working on?
Lifting assistance until now. I did not understand the question.
Is that elevating, do you think?
I'm thinking
Lifting?
elevating
Yeah.
homes.
Oh, elevating homes. So there are, it's not that we don't have funding options, but it's just that the funding options aren't that very easy to access. It takes time. Just like Maxine had explained, the process is long, and also it's a reimbursement. That itself is a big hurdle, which means that the homeowner is responsible for paying upfront, which financially could be a hardship for some people. So these are some hurdles. We do know that, and I think the state is also very well aware of it. And maybe there might be some change. Maybe these two big storms and how much we all have been impacted, that could probably bring out the change. Yes, Maxine, you want to add something to this?
Yes, I actually you hit on it pretty well. Because these programs, they've always been there, and they've always been available. The Flood Mitigation Assistance Program has always been available on an annual basis. And what that does is, what those programs are is that you can do a few things with your home. You can elevate your existing home above the base flood elevation if it is feasible to. Sometimes the foundation is not feasible to be elevated, and so the next option would be you would demolish your existing home and rebuild a new home to current standards. So there's a lot of things that kind of go into that. One of the things is, if you're demoing your existing home and rebuilding it, you have to rebuild it to the same square footage that your existing home was at. And the funding is not, you don't get as much back in reimbursement if you're doing it that way. If you're elevating your structure, you have to elevate your existing structure and not put anything else underneath it. You can't do any additions. You won't be able to do any of that. That's going to be, has to be done outside of the program. And the funding for that, because it's a reimbursement program, and yes, it is reimbursement up to a certain percentage. Typically, it's a 25-75% reimbursement, which means that the homeowner would typically be getting a 75% reimbursement for the cost. However, you have to be able to do that funding upfront to elevate, and then on a quarterly or a regular basis, you submit reports and then you get the reimbursement that way. And so typically that can be a pretty large hurdle funding wise for homeowners to be able to afford that upfront, because you do have to be able to pay for it upfront and then it gets reimbursed afterwards. So there are a few things that can be difficult for this, those types of programs that are there. They've always been there. I know that the city of St. Pete has had a very successful program with doing elevation projects with regards to the flood mitigation assistance program, and they have been doing it for quite some time. And some of our other municipalities have been doing it as well. The county is in the process of setting up internal processes for us to be able to do that starting next year for this particular thing. But right now, the way that that program is set up, it is very difficult and is a long process, and typically is hard for homeowners to be able to provide that funding up front.
We did have one additional question come in. Does Pinellas County have any plans for walls to mitigate sea level rise inundation of low-lying communities?
We're currently going through the vulnerability assessment. We don't have specifically projects which are specifically focused on that. However, I think we are doing our second round of vulnerability assessment, second phase of the vulnerability assessment. So it is definitely something that we are looking at. And Chris had shown some of the slides when you looked at that. It does talk about our sea level rise. Do we have a project which specifically focuses on that? No, not in terms of a mitigation project. However, if you look at the if you look at not an infrastructure project, but if you look at even the effort to identify a risk, that is something that the county is doing, and so are some of the jurisdictions are doing. So a mitigation project does not necessarily have to be an implementation of an infrastructure project. It could also be an educational project. It could also be something which helps us identify our risk as the first step, which will then eventually help us identify projects. So yes, that is definitely a big part of the LMS plan.
And additionally, there are other entities in the region that support some of this, like the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council. They have a living shorelines and shorelines working group that is looking at, from a regional perspective, what are some appropriate heights maybe to set seawalls in the future, because it doesn't make much sense to have one community set it at 4 feet, the next one sets it at 5 feet and 6 feet. You know, so there are some regional entities that are also looking at how to address some of these problems, and that's another facet of the local mitigation strategy working group, is to be somewhat of a convener and coalesce these other thoughts that are coming from other entities in the region. The Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council does come to these meetings. They do participate in there, and they do share ideas and thoughts that they're working on as well.
Thank you, Chris. I see one question here, which I'd like to answer, which is by Mindy. Mindy, is St. Petersburg planning to update their drainage system to reduce flooding from rain? If you're talking in terms of projects that they have, yes, they have. They recently applied for Hazard Mitigation Grant Program Idalia for upgrading for installing backflow preventers. They are also planning, this is just my understanding, but and I'm sure the city would give you more information on this, but even prior to the storms happening, they were planning to apply for BRIC for again installing backflow prevention valves throughout the city, as well as upgrading their sewer lift stations. And these are, from my understanding, is that these are all $1 million projects. So they have been they have identified these projects. They had identified the projects well in advance of the storm. It's just that we don't know when BRIC, and two of these projects were for building resilient infrastructure and communities, BRIC. We haven't seen the application period open yet, but yes, the city is looking at the drainage issue from many different perspectives. So elevating the homes is one, but they're also very well aware of the older infrastructure. They are working on this issue from many different angles. I don't know if that answers your question. Are there any other questions? If there are questions that we have missed out, so once this webinar is over, I'll go through the chat and I'll reach out to you. Like, for example, the question related to the wind mitigation, the windows, I'd find out the answer. I can get back to you on that. And of course, if this was not a question, it was just if you just added comments, that also helps. As I said, everything that we're getting from the workshop, we'll document that and will be added to the plan when we submit the plan in November. Also, if you have emailed me, I know I didn't get time to respond to everyone. However, some of the basic information about the FMA and contact information for the cities. I've been trying to share that with whoever I did respond. I did provide that. Please don't get frustrated if you don't get a response back from the cities or the towns. And that's just because we're all working right now on short-term recovery needs. And so this is a time, but that doesn't mean that you should not ask those questions. I think this is a time because none of the none of the long-term recovery funding is currently open. None of the applications are open for elevating homes or for hazard mitigation grant program. So this is a time when you should be looking through, collecting information about different grant programs, asking the questions whether it is feasible to go that route, whether a reimbursement program would work for you, how much time does it take. So it's good that you're asking the questions. I just don't want you to get frustrated if you don't get a response back immediately. It's just because we're all currently, most of the cities, the county is under emergency activation still. We're all busy with immediate recovery needs. And so that's, if you're not responding back, it's just because we're busy with those right now. There are a few more new comments. So I see a comment.
Smita, this is
Yes,
Maxine.
yes, Max.
I see a comment on here, and there's been a few regarding communication issues, and I don't know if you just answered this, so tell me if you haven't. But with regards to communication issues, if you are thinking there needs to be different communication, essentially education outreach for certain areas or regarding specific things, there is an outreach portion of this LMS plan that I head up, and it has municipality people in it as well as individual homeowners, business owners. They're called stakeholders, but they're homeowners, business owners, just people who live in that municipality. And we meet typically 3 times a year virtually. We have an entire plan for education and outreach. So if you would like to be involved in that, please reach out to your municipality and let them know that you want to be involved in that program so they can get you added in as a stakeholder. We're really big on feedback. We want to make sure that we're educating our residents and our business owners and homeowners and visitors on the effects that we have for floodplain management and flood risks, as well as other mitigation opportunities and future flood risks. So if that's a concern for yours, we appreciate that you're really wanting to be involved, and we would love for you to be involved. So please reach out to your municipal representative to let them know you want to be involved, so we can get you added into the stakeholder group.
Thank you, Maxine.
Mhm.
I see Kelly's comment. I am in Live Oaks, and many of my neighbors in flood zone D flooded twice this month. Thank you. I'm sorry to hear that, Kelly, but I appreciate you sharing this. As I mentioned before, we it's not that we have completed the risk assessment, but with the storm, I'm sure we have more areas which were flooded, which hadn't flooded before. And so your comments, as well as our experience from these storms, helps us identify those additional areas. Hopefully we would not get a storm like this of this magnitude again. But either way, I think it's important that we document this and identify these additional areas which got flooded. So any comment that you add in here is very helpful. Thank you.
Can I add to that?
Yes.
Thank you. So with regards to your areas, floodplain management in the county is aware that we have a lot of areas that have flooded due to Milton and due to Helene, and probably also during events that happened last year too. And typically during Milton this year, it was a lot of the interior canal side areas that did flood, and you typically probably haven't seen flooding in that area in the past. The county and its municipalities, I know for sure the county is very active on consistently doing on an annual basis watershed management planning, where they're looking at the watershed and we're looking at the flooding sources and new development that's been in that area, and kind of assessing and determining where those flood hazard risk areas would be. And I know that a lot of our municipalities are also working towards that as well. So with that, during each storm event, typically we do high water mark collections. So if you were in areas that did flood, you probably saw a lot of people, municipal representatives in and out of your neighborhoods, and you might have seen stakes in the grounds that say do not remove. Those are the high water mark collections that our survey teams go out and collect during the storm events. We use that data to first assess where the water level was at after a storm event, so we know which areas flooded and where they flooded and those types of things. But we also use that data to help calibrate our modeling system to make them more accurate for the most recent events that we've been having. So if you're seeing those in your area, it's because we're doing those high watermark collections. So just be aware that we're trying to take the data, the best amount of data that we get during these rainfall events, and even during the stormwater and high tide events that we're getting as well, most recently. All of these storm events, we're trying to take all that data that we have and use it to calibrate the modeling so we can plan in the future. So that's what this particular plan is to help with also. We're going to be taking all of this data and thinking about what types of mitigation projects can we use and can be incorporated into this plan, so that way we can make it better in the future. So it's really great that you guys are adding this in. Just wanted to be aware that we're trying to get that data as well. So making sure that you're documenting after a flood event areas that have flooded, so that way your municipality can collect the data effectively and use it for mitigation projects in the future is a very important thing.
Thank you, Maxine. On the same lines, Sarah, you've added this comment about the retention ponds. So all the jurisdictions are a part of our LMS, and St. Petersburg is a very active member of our LMS program. Any comments regarding, where flooding happens? What are the things which need to be improved? These are all shared not just with the state. It's not just put in the appendix and sent to the state, but it is also viewed by every jurisdiction. So everything shared here becomes visible to the jurisdiction, which helps them identify the projects, just like Maxine said. So I appreciate you sharing this. Are there any other additional questions, Ginny?
I think that looks like you've answered the majority of them that I'm seeing. If anybody has any additional ones, we do have a record of all of these chats in case we have missed anything, and we can follow up after this, but I'm not seeing any new ones at this time.
All right, I'm just checking one more time for the comments. So I'd also like to add this. So like Maxine explained, the things that we learned from the storm, that becomes a part of our analysis, and we identify new projects based on that. Now, all that does not have to be done by November 6th. We'll document whatever we have now, like everything that we get from this workshop, everything that you've emailed me or emailed others, emailed the cities. All that gets documented, and all those issues that have been highlighted in the past few weeks, we would make sure that that gets integrated into the plan and gets noticed by the state and all the jurisdictions who are a part of the LMS. However, some of this analysis, like Maxine explained, some of it might take time. However, it is our deadline for incorporating that is not November 6th. Like, that's just a deadline to meet the requirements for our 5-year update, and then submit it to the FEMA. The plan, we work on the plan throughout the year. So irrespective of whether we have a 5-year update or not, we update the plan every year. And considering that we were so heavily impacted by these storms, we would be using this time between now. Usually we work on the annual update towards the end of every year. So right now we're working on the annual update for this year, 2024. But everything that we have learned from these storms, this could be incorporated into the plan throughout the year. So it's considered more like an active document, and our project list is the resultant of everything that we learn. And the project list can be updated throughout the year. So any comments, any areas that have been flooding, any impacts that you have shared here through the chat, that helps all the jurisdictions identify the projects for which we don't have to wait for the next 5-year update. It can be added and identified as a project individually, like all the jurisdictions could identify that if something gets highlighted as a key issue, it can get incorporated into the capital improvement programs and then gets incorporated into our LMS project list. Also, before we leave, I'd like to say that if there was anyone who could not attend this meeting, and I know there was a lot of confusion as to what the purpose of this workshop is. This workshop was scheduled for a 5-year update. However, I'm sure there are people who think that this was scheduled as a part of the post-disaster recovery effort. The county as well as the cities are actively working on identifying resources for recovery, both long-term funding as well as others. And as that becomes available, that would be shared through the county's webpage as well as by the cities. That will continue. So it does not have to end with this 5-year update. This is just a regular maintenance. However, that work will continue beyond this. So if anybody has missed this meeting, of course, you can always reach out to me if you have any additional questions. And it's not that if you didn't attend the meeting, you would not be considered for funding. It's got nothing to do with the funding. It's just, as I said, we need to maintain the plan so that when the HMGB becomes available and FMA becomes available, we all can apply for it. So I appreciate your help with this. If there are no other questions, let me check one more time. Ginny, are there any other new questions?
No other new questions that we need to answer live. We're answering some via chat.
All right. Thank you so much. So I'd like to thank everyone for their time today. Thank you for joining us for the LMS workshop. If you have any questions regarding any of these questions which were posted here, or if you want to reach out to me for the LMS plan, or if you think that you want to reach out to me to ask about post-disaster recovery, please feel free to do so. I'll get you in touch with whoever can help you with that. If you have any questions, please do continue thinking. If you are thinking of elevating your home, I would suggest that you do look up those different funding sources. If you have any questions, I might not be able to answer, but if you ask me the question, I can go find out who has the answer to these questions. So please feel free to email me. Also, in terms of the response, I hope you understand if you don't get an immediate response from me, it's because we are currently under activation. We're all working 12-hour shifts, and there are emergency support functions that we are helping with right now. So there could be a delay in response. However, I would make a note. If you email me, I'll make a note of it to get back to you. All right, so if there are no other questions, I'd like to say thank you to everyone for taking out time for this. I hope you have a great evening. Thank you, everyone.